works and what do we do with our different translations. And her husband, Aaron, works with refugees and asylum seekers across Europe. They live in Italy, and so they happen to be over here. And so we're going to have workshops related to those two things, and then Grace will bring our chapel sermon. So please continue to participate as you can. Come to the workshops on Monday and on Tuesday lunch next week, and continue to learn about Helen Barrett Montgomery.
Thank you so much. If you are able, please stand with us and let us sing hymn number 48, Great is Thy Faithfulness.
Just before I introduce Dr. Myers, may I say a word of appreciation to the Lectures Committee, chaired by Dr. Kimlin Bender. Also on the Lectures Committee is Daniel Hill, Dr. Daniel Hill, Dr. Angel Santiago Vendrell, and then this particular lecture has been led by Dr. Andy Arterberry and Dr. Rebecca Poe-Hayes. Grateful for the work that our Lectures Committee does semester in, semester out to arrange and to host wonderful lectures just like this. One other thing, as Dr. Myers lectures this morning, some of you will have had opportunity to pick up a handout that had been photocopied. Others of you will be able to see clearly the screen. Yet, I think a first for Truett Seminary, there is a QR code, and if you would like to activate this, Dr. Myers has made available her slides for the lecture. So a threefold cord isn't easily broken. This or this or this, she wants you to see what she is going to share. We are so grateful that Dr. Myers, who is Associate Professor of New Testament and Greek, and also the Director of Assessment at Campbell University's Divinity School, could be with us today. Dr. Myers holds the BA from Indiana Wesleyan University, a Master's in Theological Studies from Duke Divinity School, and importantly, a PhD from the Department of Religion at Baylor University in Biblical Studies, New Testament. In fact, a world-renowned Johannine scholar is in our midst lecturing on something other than John. Dr. Myers has published 2 monographs, has co-edited 2 volumes, has written numerous book chapters and journal articles on a wide range of New Testament topics. Recently, she has published with Oxford University Press an introduction to the Gospels and Acts, and she has also written a commentary reading John in 1, 2, and 3 John in the Smith and Helwes Reading the New Testament second series. Dr. Arterberry has Reading Luke in this series. I encourage you to pick it up. Her current book projects include a Theology of the Gospel of John, which she has just completed and turned in. It's with Cambridge. And then as a project that she's presently working on is in fact related to the lecture. Helen Barrett Montgomery's centenary translation of the New Testament. So today's lecture topic, Helen Barrett Montgomery's Bible, Jesus' inclusive ministry in the Gospels. Would you please welcome to Truett Seminary, Dr. Alicia Myers.
Good morning. You all can hear me okay? I wander, so I have the lapel, so hopefully when I wander you'll still be able to hear me. Thank you all so much for being here today. I thank my colleagues at Truett Seminary for bringing me here. It is always wonderful to come back to Baylor. I told my husband, when you graduate from 3 institutions, I feel like it's the last institution that feels most like home. So I love when I get to come back to Baylor and see friends. And to be invited back to share with you work is an immense honor. So thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Arterberry, Dr. Poe-Hayes, Dr. Bender, Dr. Hill, everyone who is involved, Dr. Santiago Vendrell. Thank you so much for bringing me here. Thank you for your time this morning to listen. We talk about this amazing woman who I hope you've heard of before. But don't worry if you haven't, because you will now. Helen Barrett Montgomery. In 1924, as Dr. Poe-Hayes has told us, Helen Barrett Montgomery did something no other woman, or at least no other woman known, had ever done before, and that is to publish her English translation of the New Testament from the Greek. And it's not her own publication. It was commissioned and published by the American Baptist Publication Society. When they published it, they actually published it in 2 versions, well, not versions, but at 2 moments. They wanted it out early in February. And so they released the Gospels, and you can see that's the kind of brownish one here. And then in December, they released Acts through Revelation. I have a copy of the Gospels one. I know that the Acts and Revelation one exists, but I have not been able to find a physical copy. So if you can find one somewhere, please email me. I would really like to see it. But finally, the full version is given this title: The Centenary Translation of the New Testament, published to signalize the completion of the first 100 years of the work of the American Baptist Publication Society. It's a bit cumbersome, so far as the book title goes. She has given it this name, though, to tell you exactly what the purpose is. It's to celebrate the 100th year of the American Baptist Publication Society, particularly to commemorate their publication of Bibles and getting the Bible in the hands of everyday readers. And that's exactly what Montgomery's translation is meant to do. If you have heard of Montgomery's translation prior to this week, you probably didn't call it the Centenary Translation of the New Testament. You may have heard of it as the Montgomery New Testament, if anyone has seen this before. This is the title given to it by Holman Bible Publishers, and they came out with this edition in 1988. It's unfortunately no longer in print, but it does preserve her translation. Unfortunately, it is missing some things. At the beginning of each book in her centenary translation, Montgomery has these fascinating book introductions where you get sort of her snapshot of what she thinks the historical background of each book is, and then she gives aims. They're not consistent, like she doesn't give the same sorts of things at the beginning of every book, but she'll give you like a key verse because she wants somebody to memorize it or whatever. Unfortunately, the Montgomery New Testament doesn't have these things, probably because they become out of date at a certain point in New Testament scholarship. So if you decide, when you decide after today to go purchase your own copy of the Centenary Translation, or you access one online, make sure you can find one that has all these notes because you get a glimpse of something else from Montgomery in them. The American Baptist Publication Society's decision to commission and then publish Montgomery's translation is surprising for us. It's surprising, first of all, because Montgomery's a woman, right? Though Montgomery is a very well-known woman in the time, and unfortunately we lost sight of her in a lot of our Baptist history. She is an established best-selling author, a successful fundraiser, a leader in the women's ecumenical missionary movement, and, at this point, a former president of the Northern Baptist Convention. You can see here Daniel J. Stevens' summary of Montgomery in his report that he gave in 1925. He said, the translator was Mrs. Helen Barrett Montgomery, already widely known as a missionary executive, author, and platform speaker, designed to promote the popular reading of the scriptures and to that end given a typological dress that would assist the average reader to quickly grasp the material. The translation at once received very favorable comment from scholars who compared it with other modern translations. You can see why Stevens wasn't asked to translate, because that's a very complicated sentence. What's interesting here is that Stevens does not justify her gender, and he almost seems to downplay her leadership roles. He doesn't highlight her education or the fact that she's a former president of the convention. He calls her Mrs. Helen Barrett Montgomery, even though she's been awarded honorary degrees at this point. He's playing this line of she's done something great, but she's also safe. Nevertheless, we do know that Stevens is right. Montgomery's translation does receive the attention from a few New Testament scholars, including A.T. Robertson, who is perhaps the best-known New Testament scholar, Baptist New Testament scholar of her day, one of the most well-known New Testament scholars, period, in the time. He reviewed her translations twice in publications. He includes her translations listed in kind of outlines of New Testament studies that he would publish these books to try to tell pastors, here's what's going on in scholarship. And he included her translations, which is surprising because most people are ignoring her work, right? In private correspondence, he sends her this letter. My dear Mrs. Montgomery, I have meant for some time to write you, though I think that I have failed to do so. In appreciation of your kindly words about me in the Baptist, and in particular, in appreciation of your wonderfully fine translation of the New Testament. It has some points of excellence over any other, and here shown in reproducing the Greek idiom and in a happy preservation of the atmosphere of the original. It's surprising, though still, that the APBS did this, because you have to understand that at this moment in time, there were so many new English translations of the Bible coming out. reports. Critical edition of the Greek New Testament in 1881. We also have around this time the publication of the Revised Standard Version in Great Britain. You know, NRSV today. Now my students get to do NRSV, right? Which they keep adding over time. Oops, what's happening? Teams is calling me. No, I know. But when Montgomery is asked to publish this translation, she's doing so in the midst of a competitive market. So you can see here just some of them. This is the 20th century New Testament. I'm sure you've never heard of this before. This one was published by and translated by an unknown committee, who we find out later was. This one was actually started by 2 women as well. But we'll find out later. You have Francis Wayland's 1903 New Testament in modern speech, and Montgomery uses Weymouth. She uses Weymouth when she's teaching, and then when you read her translation, you can see the places where she's been influenced by Weymouth. You have Moffat's 1913 translation. She also uses that, and then right after her, you have Goodspeed come out in 1925. And this is a pretty competitive market. And also, you should know that the American Baptists produced their own complete Bible in 1912. But in 1924, they have commissioned another one. And we could talk about maybe why they did that with what happened with this translation, but we can do that later. You can also see the size. So this was the thing to do, was to make these kind of like pocket New Testaments that people could carry. So you can see this is the leather-bound version of the Centenary translation. This is the cloth-bound, which I also have here. If you guys want to see it, this is the first edition. But it should fit in your pocket. The one that's a little chunky here is the 20th century New Testament. Anything done by committee feels like it's going to be bigger, right? But you can see how these are comparably sized to be carried around. They were meant for everyday readers. Yet the ABPS reported that Montgomery's translation sold with great rapidity. That's what Stephen said. They knew Montgomery's name would sell books, particularly to women and to non-scholarly audiences. And that was just who Montgomery had in mind for her work. For Montgomery, the point of any Bible translation was to get it in the hands and into the hearts of everyday readers. Once they read it repeatedly, she believed, Montgomery knew the biblical story would transform readers, because it was through this story that God revealed God's self to the world. This story finds its culmination in Jesus Christ. Montgomery especially valued the Gospels. In the time we have today, I'm just going to focus on her translation of the Gospels, but when we go to lunch, if you want to talk about Acts or you want to talk about Paul, we can do it. Before we dive into the translation itself, I want to set the stage a little bit by telling you a bit more about Montgomery's understanding of the Bible overall. Fundamentally, what's happening? There we go. Fundamentally, Montgomery believed the Bible is universally applicable and relevant to all humanity, and that it's actually meant for everyone, not just for one group of people. And we'll talk about this. She gets very clear that the Bible is not the possession of anyone. She also believes the Bible provides a blueprint for missionary activity in the world. And in this way, she's very similar to a colleague of mine, Dr. Caleb Olavo, where he talks about the Missio Dei. What is the mission of God that you participate in, right? It's not our ministries, it's God's work, and we participate in it. And that is what Montgomery sees in the Bible. This is what God has been doing all along, and you're invited to participate in it. In her 1920 book, The Bible and Missions, Montgomery writes this: the Bible is, in its very subconscious substance, missionary. Not only because of what it advocates, or purposes, or states, but because of what it is. The Bible is the great missionary charter of the church. Just as in measuring a man, it is not so much his conscious words and deeds that count, but his very atmosphere and selfhood. The Bible, being what it is, cannot avoid becoming the book of man. It is foreordained to universality. While Montgomery believed the universality of the Bible is clear, she ultimately argues this identity and God's plan of salvation become most clear in the person and work of Jesus Christ. So she continues in this book. On this beautiful background of universality, Jesus paints his gospel for man. There are two centers to his thoughts: the Father God, whom he has come to reveal, and the kingdom of God, which he has come to establish. Jesus' as both Father and Lord leads to what she calls a real spiritual union. And this is for all believers, regardless of race, gender, class, socioeconomic status, nationality. She writes, quote, "All creedal and national and racial limitations disappear as the Son of Man reveals the eternal," unquote. And his revelation makes possible a new way of living, a new way to have blessed fellowship with the Father. For Montgomery, her view of the Bible then shows you exactly why she translates. She initially started her translation making Sunday school materials and teaching children, right? And she was asked then to publish this. She wrestled with it. And she publishes in an article in 1925 in this denominational paper, Publication the Baptist, explaining why she translates. And she identifies 3 parts. She says, "Sometimes I would be dissatisfied with the translation, and always dissatisfied with the mechanical form of the translation. Furthermore, from practical experience in teaching the Bible, I have become convinced that stately and bold expressions, which had such a charm for the literary minded, were a bar and a hindrance to the less educated to an extent little realized by those brought up in Christian homes." And finally, she says, "So my point of view in making this translation was to consider young people, busy Sunday school teachers, and foreigners to try to make it plain." And make it plain is about how you can summarize her work. In the translation itself, Montgomery identifies 7 aims. And in all this, I want you to see that she never says, "And it's okay that I'm a woman." It's not that. She believes that she, as a Christian and as a Baptist in particular, you can see this, she has the right to interpret, to translate and interpret Scripture. So she doesn't linger on her gender in these contexts. But she identifies 7 aims. So in her introduction to her New Testament, right, when you open up your favorite annotated New Testament, because you all have, right, and you read the introduction, because that's the best part to read, it's very thick, and it tells you all, oh, here's who's on the committee, and here's the methodology that we use for translating, here's the manuscripts that we use. Now, New Testament people, we want to know that. And as a New Testament professor, I tell my students, please read that, you should know what you're reading, right? But Montgomery does not do that. This is her introduction. It's 1 page. And to summarize her 7 principles, she says, "My goal was to make it easy to read, but keep language that still sounds biblical. Keep visible chapter and verse divisions to help readers." She's like, yes, they're added later, but people know that, deal with it. Use paragraph headings to help people memorize things. She wants to format writings according to English format. So make dialogue, make poetry. Remove undue literary formality. She believed, like so many of these other people translating the gospel, what they would call modern speech, that the gospels were written for everyday people. And that when we make it so erudite, we're actually distorting the purpose of these writings. Keep it affordable and easy to carry. Her copy of the Gospels was 25 cents. And then finally, love that this is 7, commemorate the work of the American Baptist Delegation Society. She puts that last, right? And this is so true to who she is. And then she ends, so she really does have to be. She says this is a work of faith. So her last paragraph tells you that this is the result of many happy years of work, and that she's done this with great faith and humility, in the hope that it will bring and spark devotion amongst the readers. And on the next page, she has this My Declaration of Discipleship. It shows you she just expects this to impact you, where you put your name and your date of when you started your personal relationship with Jesus, right? There's not one of those in the SBL Bible, sorry. All right. You can see that this is an example from 1 Corinthians 11, kind of the formatting I want to show you. This is why I had like 33 slides that I sent to Dr. Coates and Dr. Arbery, and they have graciously created a QR code so you can see them all. But you can see here, we've got a clear chapter title right in the middle. You're not going to miss it, right? Even though my students now struggle because we're in numerals, right? But I have a title for the chapter in full, like big all caps, directions about public worship. And then you can see right underneath it, the chapter, right? Right here, for Fridays at church meetings. But I have the verse numbers all along the side. so I can find things. Right, so here's my paragraph headings. And then a note down at the bottom. These are the best because she'll tell you, like in a sentence, why she's done something that might be really weird to you, or like there's no extra actual information, but here she's just like, the Jewish tradition required a man to be veiled during worship. All the New Testament scholars are like, did it? Right? Like, but that's not her point. Her point is like, I read all this stuff, just believe me, this explains that. And when Mandy and when Dr. McMichael and I will come out, we'll talk to you more about what she does with 1 Corinthians 11, because her point is, this doesn't mean women today should wear veils or shouldn't be in leadership. This is a passage from Luke, so you can see kind of how narrative formatting is. You can see the same things, like the paragraph headings, but also you can see the formatting that this looks like a story, right? So the New Testament scholarship, often when I talk to my students about the rise of what we call narrative criticism, the radical idea of reading the gospel as a story, we came up with it in the 21st century. She's done this long, long before, right? She said, well, this is a story, so I'm going to format it as a story. So you can see that she's got paragraphs and paragraphs, dialogue is dialogue, right? And poetry is poetry. And that's fascinating because Montgomery herself is a published poet. So it's fun to see the places where she sees poetry, she'll format something as poetry. Sometimes when you won't expect it, and then there'll be places where you expect it and it's not. So how formatting conveys interpretation is huge in this work. The other thing you don't see here, but you'll see on a future slide, is she puts all her Old Testament quotations in italics, and then she'll put notes on the bottom of where to go find it. So she's helping her readers the whole time. With this, Montgomery aims to make plain Jesus' life. So the other thing that Montgomery publishes is a harmonization of the four Gospels called The Story of Jesus Told by His Four Friends. And that comes out in 1927. It's thicker than her New Testament, the whole thing, it's longer. And at the beginning she says, I believe that knowing the full story of Jesus changes people. And it's my hope that by hearing this full story, people will put together who Jesus is. It's so important to her that people know Jesus' life and his model. Because sometimes, it turns out, Jesus' disciples don't always live up to that. She writes in Western Women in Eastern Lands in 1910 the following. The democracy of the New Testament got its seal and inspiration in the teachings and practices of Jesus. He took up the old teaching of the prophets, obscured by the prejudice of centuries, brushed aside the dishonoring conventions which the rabbis had built up, and associated with women in the plane of beautiful, free, human relationship. He sat weary by the well, conversing with a woman, to the scandalizing of his disciples. Who thought it was quite beneath him as a holy man and a rabbi. To women he reared the lovely memorial of his praise, and at the faith of women he marveled. Women followed him and ministered to him. He alone among the religious teachers had a word of hope for the harlot, and to a woman he gave the first resurrection commission. I love that, you could put the passage she's thinking of in each of those little phrases. Due to Jesus' liberation of women, Montgomery says that should encourage us to see and to take our liberation, our emancipation. But she also concludes and concedes that it was hard for the male disciples even in Jesus' day to recognize it. And she says, quote, "It is not strange if his disciples could at not once rise to the height of his example and his teaching," unquote. Since the disciples couldn't follow Jesus' lead, women in her day shouldn't be surprised when the men of their day cannot do it either. But instead of giving in to these shortcomings, Montgomery calls on women to act. She writes, "If, as we have seen, the ethnic faiths have no clear gospel for the emancipation of woman and child, if outside Christians' homes they still labor under the most cruel disabilities of both law and custom, if in our own land it is the spirit of the gospel of Christ which most powerfully wars against intemperance, lust, and greed, woman's hereditary foes, the duty of Christian women is to put within the reach of their sisters in other lands this good tidings of great joy is coming. The great emancipator of the mother and child must be made known in every dark corner of the earth." Part of the way this message is to be spread is the translation of Bibles. And that's really what her book, The Bible and Missions, is all about. She wants people to have a copy and to read it. And that's the goal of her translation as well. But already in these quotations that I've read, I hope something's been triggered in you to say, this is great, but there's problems. We will talk about those below. The short overview now is going to give us enough to kind of dig into the Gospels a little bit more. So if you have your NRC or whatever translation you usually use, you can kind of look at it alongside what I'm going to give you from the Centenary translation, and you'll really see the places that she's done something different if you have your Greek New Testament to impress all your Greek professors. Dr. Weaver, pull that out and you'll really see what I'm talking about. Okay? So in this time we have left today, I'm just going to do 4 examples with y'all. We're going to talk about Luke 1 and 2, and how in Montgomery's translation we see Mary's increased visibility and agency. We'll talk about Luke 8, 1 to 3, where she describes the women disciples ministering to Jesus. Third, John 4, 27 to 30, the Samaritan woman as the first missionary. And then finally, Luke 4, 23 to 27 is the place where we'll pick a little bit at the limits of Montgomery's understanding of inclusion. Okay, so let's start with example 1. Looking at an image from Montgomery's translation on the slide, you can see the passage subheadings, right? And hopefully on your phone you can see it. On average, she includes the passage subheadings for about every 5 verses in the Gospels. This creates bite-sized passages that help readers remember the content, right? That's one of her aims. But it also means Montgomery's division can make women characters, who are often read over or ignored, appear more regularly in the text. They just show up more. Not always. One place this is true, though, is in Luke 1 and 2. In this section, there are 24 subheadings for 131 verses. This was the time the Bible scholar got to do math. It was really fun. That means we're close to our 5-verse average for subheading, but some sections are really long, while others will only be a single verse. So you can see that 221 has its own heading here. And that's because those are the ones she really thinks people need to know, right? Of the subheadings in this section, though, 5 of them contain women's names. 4 times we have Mary's name. So in 139 to 46, Mary seeks Elizabeth. I have 2 women there, right? 147 to 56, Mary's Magnificat. 224 or 22 to 24, Mary offers 2 doves. This should be 234 to 35. A sword shall pierce Mary's heart, and then 236 to 38, aged Anna testifies. And at first you may say to me, well, Dr. Myers, 5 in the midst of 24 doesn't sound like a lot. Well, in the same 24, there's only 5 that have Jesus' name in them. Only 3 that have John the Baptist, and 8 that are general, they don't have anybody's name. So when reading this section of Luke, Montgomery makes it harder for you to miss the crucial role that women play. Montgomery's heading at Luke 22 to 24 is especially interesting to me, because it points to an interpretive issue that I can show you contemporary Luke scholars still debate. Montgomery gives the section the subheading, Mary offers 2 doves, and then offers the following translation. And when the days for their purification, according to the law of Moses, had passed, they took him up to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord, him being Jesus. As it is written in the law of Moses, every firstborn male shall be called holy to the Lord, and they also offered a sacrifice as commanded in the law of the Lord, a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. The italicized portions designate our Old Testament quotations, which Montgomery identifies below as Exodus 13:2, Leviticus 12:8, right? The difficulty isn't really which passages Luke is quoting here, but how he's interpreting them, particularly Leviticus 12. Leviticus 12 describes the impurities after childbirth. If you want to have a whole conversation about what purity and impurity is in Second Temple Judaism, we can do that. But these impurities are only attached to the postpartum woman in Leviticus. Leviticus 12:6-8 reports that the woman should bring a sin offering to the priest to, quote, make atonement for her and to purify her from her source of blood, that is, from her postpartum bleeding. So why is it their purification in Luke? And who is the they who offered a sacrifice as commanded in the law of the Lord? Scholars have given us a few options over the years. Lutron, right? Easy. So generally it's not. Or it's an indication that Jesus was also considered impure. And that startles us, but that's actually like the dominant view of the first century because infants are liminal and they're connected to their mothers. But it could also be that Luke's just generalizing a whole family together and using the they in a more generalized way. But Montgomery glosses over these problems with her heading. Mary offers two doves. So while there's some unknown days, Montgomery doesn't have your eye linger there. She has you focus on Mary. It does a couple things. It means Luke does not misinterpret Leviticus 12. She helps him have a pass. And this fits because Montgomery, like a lot of New Testament scholars of her day, believed Luke was what they would use this phrase. He's a first-rate historian. And oftentimes it would be New Testament scholars or classicists who have to catch up to the accuracy of what Luke has actually written. So that's her predisposition here with this passage anyway. But second, it keeps the focus on Mary. It means that Mary herself knows and obeys Mosaic law. She leads her family in worship. She takes care of her own impurity. And she then is a model mother whose faith provides a guide for later Christian mothers. And it should inspire missionaries to focus on converting wives and mothers, to value the lives of women and girls, to help them become what she saw as lights in the dark corner of the earth. So when you read her other missionary work, she will emphasize the importance of reaching women. And here we see, maybe she saw that with Mary, that Mary had something to do with the faithful raising of even Jesus Christ. Our next example comes from Luke 8, the women ministering to Jesus. So Montgomery highlights the role of women who worked alongside Jesus in his lifetime as well. And this happens in Luke 8, 1-3. And here's her translation. So she gives the title of the chapter, Jesus, the Lord of Life and Nature, and then her passage, a second preaching tour in Galilee. She translated, it happened shortly afterwards that he began to go from town to town and village to village, preaching and telling the good news of the kingdom of God. The 12 were with him, and certain women whom he had delivered from evil spirits and various diseases. Mary of Magdala, out of whom 7 demons had been driven, and Joanna, the wife of Chusa, Herod's steward, and Susanna, and many other women who used to minister to him out of their substance. First, notice that Montgomery's translation includes men and women in Jesus' second preaching tour. They're around to get to teaching. In the Bible and missions, she gives an explicit interpretation of this passage, writing, on his second missionary tour, Jesus takes the members of his missionary training school with him. This verse, she cites this passage. And with them also go the members of the First Women's Missionary Society. So please give generously, right? Montgomery saw in Jesus a precedent for the work she and others were doing in establishing schools and raising money to fund missionary work. Second, notice her translation, used to minister to him out of their substance. The Greek word for used to minister is diakonou, right? This is an imperfect form of diakoneo. You can do it, translate it this way, which A.T. Robertson would love this. It can be an iterative, habitual thing, that they're ministering to him repeatedly. This is their habit, and it is ministry. This is a perfectly reasonable rendering of this word. The noun form is sometimes translated as deacon, diakonos, Romans 16. Though Montgomery prefers minister. She shows a preference for translating diakoneo as ministering, but she allows context to inform her rendering as well. This means translating diakonou as used to minister in Luke 8:3 is intentional. It equates this work with that of later deacons and ministers in the Christian movement. Montgomery's not alone in this interpretation, so I'm giving you here's these modern ones that are out, and here's what they did with it. So you can see here, James Moffat has something similar as her. 20th century New Testament does, so does the American Standard Version, that's the ASV. But it did contrast on Weymouth, Goodspeed, and the Revised Version. You can see the ways they kind of answer. I love women, all of whom contributed to the support. Right? Montgomery makes the same choice of translating diakoneo, minister or used to minister, in Matthew 27:55 and Mark 15:41. Those are the scenes where the women disciples from Galilee are gathered at the cross, watching Jesus die in the absence of the male disciples. Montgomery clearly harmonizes that moment with this summary in Luke's gospel. But Montgomery makes it plain that women were involved in part of Jesus' ministry throughout his lifetime, thus encouraging contemporary Christian women to continue this work, even when men around them failed to recognize their callings, and even when other women did too. You might also note that Montgomery's translation notes the women used to minister to him rather than to them. This is her decision on a text-critical issue, but I really think it comes from her, again, harmonizing with Matthew 27 and Mark 15, because in there it is out to him, not out voice to him. So she's made this harmonizing. But it also means the women's focus is on Jesus. They're not just taking care of the men. Our third example is John 4:27-30. Montgomery gives Jesus' conversation with the Samaritan woman in John 4 a special place in her writings. Returning again to the Bible and missions, she emphasizes the active role of the Samaritan woman, and I love this quote. In Jesus' conversation with the woman, he had been led from death to death, to the announcement of his messiahship, with his gift of the water of life, to the discourse of the spirituality of the true worship of God, neither in this mountain nor yet in Jerusalem, but in spirit and truth, and to the deepest truth of all, the seeking Father God. It is fascinating that the woman is not a passive recipient of Jesus' message, but she draws him out with her conversation. In 4:27-30, then, we have this title for the passage, the first missionary. And at first you could say, well, that's Jesus, because he's talking to her. But it's the passage he chooses to name this way, right? So 4:27-30, just then his disciples came up and were astonished that he was talking with a woman. Yet none of them asked him, what do you want? Or, why are you talking with her? Then the woman left her water jar, went away to the city, and began saying to the people, come, see a man who has told me everything that I ever did. He can't be the Christ, can he? They left the city and set out to go to him. It is her. She is the one who goes. Jesus hasn't gone anywhere. And when Jesus finally does show up in 4:39, he is then doing the missionary work. And what this does is it creates this huge contrast between the Samaritan woman as a missionary and then the male disciples who come back. And I love the way she translates it. They are anxious, and they're like fretting over Jesus. Jesus, you really need to eat something. And I love how this just sort of inverts kind of gender expectations, right? It's, the woman's not fretting over is Jesus eating today. She goes out and she's doing something. When Jesus comes to town, he then is the one reaping what the woman has sown, which is his word. So she becomes this model of a missionary. And in her harmonization of the four Gospels, she even puts this story before the calling of the 12. So she always retains the Samaritan woman as the first missionary. But there are some limits. So now we're going to finish by looking at 4:23-27. Montgomery underscores universality and inclusion, but also her translation can reveal cracks and limits in her own vision. In her translation of Jesus' initial teaching in Nazareth, she ties his message of God's incorporation of non-Jews to the problem of racism in her context. So she translates this passage as follows. Jesus' challenge to race prejudice. Jesus answered, doubtless you will quote the proverb to me, physician, heal yourself. Do here in your own country all that we heard you have done in Capernaum. I tell you the solemn truth, he added, that no prophet is acceptable in his own country. In very truth I tell you, there are many widows in Israel in the days of Elijah, when the heavens were closed for 3 years and 6 months, when a great famine came over all the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any one of them, but only to a widow in Zarephath of Sidon. And there were many lepers in Israel in the days of the prophet Elisha. yet none of them was cleansed, but only Naaman the Syrian. This is the only passage in her centenary translation that explicitly names race prejudice, which is her word for racism. But you can see her emphasis on inclusion and impartiality elsewhere. So in other subheadings, we'll get intolerance rebuked, or all-inclusive gospel, impartial justice for all, or one purpose of mercy for all. In Montgomery's day, she is facing something that many of us like to forget as a part of white Western Christianity, and particularly in missions. Entrenched racism fueled eugenics theories that were used to discourage missionary and social justice movements and to reinforce imperialistic endeavors that dehumanize non-Western and non-white people. Montgomery recognized that this belief and behavior was antithetical to God's plan and to Jesus' message. In the Bible and Mission, she writes, the church has failed, up to the present moment, to interpret her own worldwide mission. She has spent her strength on definitions while the world lay in agony, created lesser folk without the law, while missions were denied their birthright in the gospel, has wrapped race prejudice about her like a garment, and from her coffers of abundance flung a few coins now and then, with which to finance the army of the Prince of Peace for the world. For Montgomery, Jesus' mission is for all people, and all people are created in the image of God, and it was distorted when thwarted by one people or nation alone. So while we can appreciate this from Montgomery and name it, we should also mention the ways that are problematic in how she went about this work. First, we should notice who acts as a foil for Jesus and his message in Luke 4. The Galilean Jews, who were being oppressed and occupied by Romans. Such an interpretation that Montgomery gives us ignores the very real differences between first century Jews and her contemporary racist white American and Europeans. They are closer to Romans than they ever are to the Jews. Unfortunately, then, Montgomery's translation repeats a lot of the unexamined anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism of her day. And this is something that feminism in particular has wrestled with. What does Jesus save us from? Well, Jesus liberates us even from Judaism, right? This is a terrible understanding of first century Judaism. And it also divorces Jesus from his own context. Jesus is Jewish. This is his context that nurtured him, and he never rejected it. When you see her next subheading, the response runs true to form, we really see it. There's the assumption that the Jews here, of course, will reject Jesus. And of course, there are negative examples of Jews in the New Testament. They're not always positive characters. But her translation will repeatedly divorce Jesus and later Paul from that Jewish context, with really problematic results. And this is 1924. We're walking toward World War II and the Holocaust, and Christians participate in that. Second, as I noted above, Montgomery viewed non-American and really all non-Western settings that did not have Western Protestant mission as, quote, dark corners of the earth. She saw complete congruence between Western ideals of democracy, education, work ethics, and propriety, especially for women, with the gospel. As late as 1929, in her From Jerusalem to Jerusalem, Montgomery wrote about, quote, the barbaric, savage, and backward races, unquote, that needed to be evangelized through the expansion of Western Christianity. She believed that starting the gospel would result in liberation for women and children because it would bring democracy and education to all places. It would enable non-Western women to become like Montgomery and other white Western middle and upper class women. What Montgomery did not see or could not engage with critically is that she ultimately equated evangelism of Christ with evangelism of American imperialism and white supremacy. And you can see that here in this photo in particular. So here she says, where races meet and fraternize, blinding, and all these women and children, but who's on the top? Montgomery's story then, and her translation of the New Testament, is one of a mixed legacy. We can see in her work aspects that transcend her era and her social location. She sees in Jesus God's desire for all people to participate in a divine unity where none is superior together, where Christ is Lord of all. As a result, Montgomery believed she and other women had something important, crucial to give to the world, and she spent her life trying to give it. She had the audacity to answer the calling God had for her. She studied, she preached, she taught, she led, she prayed, she traveled around the world, and even published her own translation of the New Testament. At the same time, a closer look shows us that Montgomery, too, was a human. There are significant limits to our understanding of God's inclusion and liberation, and we can't gloss over them. So she writes, strictly speaking, there is no Christian nation, but only nations in the process of becoming Christian. But even so, the steady pressure of Bible ideals, exerted slowly and against tremendous difficulties, has already brought a revolution in the position of women. Where? In the U.S., and along with other Western European countries, they offer the model for other nations to follow. This equation of Jesus' message with Western democracy reveals Montgomery's unexplored idealization of white middle-class ways of living. Thus, Jesus' message liberates humanity, but since it replicates the American-style democracy and economics of Montgomery's era, this liberation often replicates the very oppression Montgomery thinks it undermines. Montgomery, though, was aware that her work, like any other interpreter, me too, should be critiqued and corrected by later readers. In a letter to a concerned woman studying at a missionary training school in Chicago in 1915, she writes the following. You see, life is very intricate, and thought and reason are not simply matters to be decided offhand by one. Each of us sees one little portion of the truth. None of us gets the whole truth from the Bible. Our great-grandchildren will see things there which our prejudice and limitations conceal from us, just as we are seeing things which are hidden to our grandfathers. It is with her invitation, then, that I say we should continue listening to God's callings, to read Scripture carefully, explore the translations that we use and the translations that we create, thinking through the limits that we too are placing on God's plan. Which voices do we ignore? Whose values do we prioritize? And what does God have to say to us today about those choices? It's my prayer, and I think Montgomery would agree, that we stay open to learning, to continuing to study and to be challenged, secure not in our own abilities, but confident of the callings that we have been given, and ultimately standing in the love of God that invites participation and connection rather than conquest and alienation. Thank you.
Thank you for such a lively lecture and for teaching us how to love the material that we are working on. Remarkable. There is lunch provided for us in the Great Hall. If you've signed up for lunch, you will have easy entry. If you have not, would you just kind of hang back a bit? There is probably a bean in the pot for you, but just let those who've signed up go first, and hopefully there'll be enough for all. And we do hope that you will join the lunch, but also the conversation with Dr. Myers to follow. It is likely that you have any number of questions now that this very stimulating lecture has created. So please do take the time to come. May I just offer a brief word of prayer then, and we'll be dismissed. Lord, we're mindful that now we gaze in a glass dimly, but then face to face. Now we know in part, but then we shall know fully, even as we have been fully known. So now abide faith, hope, love, these three. And we're grateful this day that we've been reminded afresh that the greatest of these is love, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. You're dismissed.